Greetings everyone, and today I have a bit of a special lens to present to you, the Zeiss Otus 55mm f1.4. I've actually never had many requests to test this particular lens, probably because its prohibitive price of £4,000 and manual focus only design means that it's hardly an everyday item on the shopping lists of the huddled proletariat masses, myself included. Still, working professionals and wealthy hobbyists might be interested, as well as people like me who are just curious. It's for full-frame digital SLR cameras and can be adapted onto mirrorless cameras too. I'd like to say a big thank you to Simon Danson, a fan of this channel, who very kindly loaned me this camera lens for a couple of weeks for testing. Thank you very much, Simon. The lens was released back in 2013 to quite a lot of marketing hype. Zeiss themselves and many others declared it to be the sharpest 50mm, or thereabouts, camera lens ever released, and at the time it pretty much was, by a considerable margin, and so that price tag was sort of justified in a way, although only a year later the Sigma 50mm f1.4 Art came out, which was almost as good but at a fifth of the price. But whatever the history, there's no denying that this standard prime lens has simply enormous potential and could become a real workhorse for portrait photographers in particular. Let's look at its build quality first, which is absolutely exceptional as you would imagine. Every part of the lens has been designed to exacting detail, and it's as joyous to handle as it is to behold. At just over a kilogram, its metallic body feels weighty in the hand, but still well balanced. Oddly enough, the rear lens mount doesn't have a weather sealing gasket, quite a surprising omission there. In use, it's a pretty simple lens. The aperture is controlled by your camera, leaving you with just a rubberized manual focus ring. It turns incredibly smoothly and with a long throw, so you can adjust focus very easily and precisely. It worked very well for me with the focus guide on my Canon EOS R camera, by the way. Its only disadvantage is that the rubber focus ring picks up a little dust. As usual though, focusing manually will slow you down and is difficult if you're shooting a moving subject. The lens does exhibit a little focus breathing, as you can see here, zooming in a bit as you focus more closely to your subject. The filter thread size is 77mm wide, and the lens comes with a lovely hood that's flocked on the inside. It does not have image stabilization. Overall, the build quality is pretty timeless, as you'd hope for a $4,000 manual focus lens. Let's look at its image quality then, firstly on a full frame camera. I've mounted it onto a Sony a7R II here with a 42MP sensor. In the middle of the image we see very good sharpness and good contrast, although the image isn't perfectly sharp. Let's look over into the corners. They actually look just a tiny little bit sharper than the middle, just marginally. That's an unusual characteristic, but not unheard of. Stop down the aperture to f2 and the corners have just a tiny edge of extra sharpness. The middle shows some extra sharpness at f2 and noticeably better contrast, and stop down to f2.8 for perfection in the middle of your image and a lot more brightness in the corners. f4 and f5.6 both look a little sharper, and now the corners look about as good as you can get. The lens stays this sharp down to f16, where just a little softness begins to creep in. So it's quite a brilliant performance on a full frame camera here, although the middle of the image could have just an edge of extra contrast at f1.4, but all around it could be just about the sharpest 50mm or so lens that I've tested, despite it being about 7 years old now. Well, let's test it on an APS-C camera. I'm going to really challenge this thing by adapting it onto a Canon EOS M6 Mark II, which has a ravenous little monster of a 32MP camera sensor that devours almost any camera lens mounted onto it. At f1.4, the middle of the image is averagely sharp with a hint of purple fringing, but that's actually not too bad considering that we're on such a high resolution sensor. The image corners are noticeably fuzzy. Stop down to f2 and we don't see much change in the corners, but we do see a bit more contrast and resolution back in the middle. Stop down to f2.8 and image quality in the middle becomes just about perfect, and the corners look a little sharper now too. Stop down to f4 and they look very sharp, and at f5.6 almost perfect. This time, on an APS-C camera, you only need to stop down to f11 to see softness emerging from the effects of diffraction, and f16 is really quite soft. Overall then, on a very high resolution camera such as this, it's actually not a bad performance, and other 50mm lenses would be far worse. Still, you'll have to deal with a little softness at f1.4 and corner softness until you stop down to about f4. Let's look at distortion and vignetting on a full frame camera now. The lens projects a small amount of barrel distortion, although a little less than average for a 50mm optic. At f1.4 we see a fair bit of vignetting though, those corners look fairly dark. Those corners brighten up at f2, and at f2.8 we see fairly uniform brightness across the whole image, so the results for distortion and vignetting are slightly better than average for a 50mm lens. Now let's see how the lens works against bright light. It's a really excellent performance here. We see almost no flaring and only a little very light glaring, even when bright lights are directly in the frame, so that's a great performance really, much better than average. The lens can focus down to 50cm, a tiny bit further than average, so you won't be confusing this with a macro lens. But the good news is that close-up image quality remains nice and sharp, even at f1.4. Although, as before, stop down to f2 for a little more sharpness and contrast. Now, let's take a look at the quality of this lens's bokeh. Personally, I like it a lot. It's lovely and smooth without any particular weaknesses. In some pictures, at medium distances, the background rendering can be a tiny bit on the heavy side, just a tiny bit blocky. And related to bokeh is longitudinal chromatic aberration. At f1.4, we can see some colourfulness on bokeh highlights, the common pink in the foreground and green in the background. It remains at f2, although at f2.8 the colours are pretty much back to normal now. Well, what can we say overall? Well, this lens is not quite perfect, but in many ways it is brilliant. I can't tell you how enjoyable it is to use, and its optical quality is clearly excellent. The issue here really is how much it costs. As I said, £4,000 is a little excessive, to put it mildly. Simply taking into consideration this lens's extremely high price, and considering that there are lenses which are almost as sharp and with autofocus nowadays for much less money, I can't quite recommend it. Alternative lenses with similar sharpness and autofocus include the Canon RF 50mm f1.2, the Sony Zeiss 50mm f1.4, the Nikon Z 50mm f1.8, and even the older Sigma 50mm f1.4 art lens that I mentioned before is nearly as sharp as this Zeiss offering. All of those newer lenses have arrived since the Zeiss lens came out and have been nipping at its heels ever since, although I'm not sure if any of them are quite as sharp. So in 2020, this Zeiss lens is quite seriously overpriced in my opinion, and my feelings about it are slightly muted as a result, but still, anyone who owns it shouldn't have much reason to complain, because that costly price tag does not get in the way of its optical performance and build quality being quite beautiful. It certainly has many happy owners, and it does take exceptional pictures.